When we scheduled Buttonwood, we of course knew that it would come on the eve of the United States election, and that would be a backdrop to everything we talked about over these 2 days. But I don't think even we appreciated the extent to which the enormous policy questions that are to be determined by the outcome of this election are such an enormous player in the economic outlook right now. Huge questions about taxes, about entitlements, about spending, about the size and trajectory of the national debt. And so in some ways, I think it's appropriate that the first panel of Buttonwood this year be specifically devoted to this question of what exactly happens to some of these enormous fiscal choices facing America after November the 6th. To answer this question, we have a terrific panel, and I'm going to introduce them now. First of all, Jared Bernstein, Glenn Hubbard, and Maya MacGuineas. Jared, I'm going to start with you. I've known you for years, but of course, now most people know you as the guy who spent 2 years as an embed in the Obama administration observing everything going on in those crazy few years. But now you're a free man. You can say what you think, even if it's rude about your former boss. Sure. Well, let me ask you, I think one of the biggest questions, especially people worried about the impact of the fiscal cliff on the trajectory of growth next year, is what happens if Obama's reelected? And he once again is in a situation where Republicans want to extend all the tax cuts, but Obama has been about as clear as he possibly could be that he will under no circumstances sign an extension of the tax cuts for the wealthy. Is Obama prepared to let the country go over the fiscal cliff and bring on a recession, as people like the Congressional Budget Office have predicted, in order to stand by that principle?
Well, first of all, it's great to see you. We have been friends and colleagues for a long time, and it's a real honor to be here with Glenn and Maya as well. The president has been extremely clear and explicit, as well as Senate Democrats, about the intention to allow the upper end Bush tax cuts to expire. And that leads to $1 trillion of deficit savings over 10 years. That's real money. Doesn't get you out of the hole, but it does start building the ladder that we need. I would not accept the way, with due respect, the question was teed up in the sense, does this mean that the president will bring the economy into recession? You have to understand two things. First of all, the president, and I believe really every objective, responsible person who looks at our budget situation would come away with this conclusion. We can't achieve a sustainable budget path simply on spending cuts alone. There have to be revenues in the deal as well, and this strikes the president, I think, correctly as the right place to start, the expiration of the high-end Bush tax cuts. That's the top 2% of households. Everybody agrees about the other 98%. So I would never characterize it as the president's bringing the economy over the fiscal cliff if it's the intransigence of Republicans and others and anyone, including the president's opponent in this election, who have signed the Grover Norquist pledge. That's what would take us, in my view, that's what would force us over the cliff and potentially into a downturn. One final point. I do believe, just on the economics, that the fiscal cliff should be thought of as probably more of a slope. It would be a very bad thing to go over the fiscal cliff, but if we could reverse the full tax increases and the sequestration, the automatic spending cuts relatively quickly, I don't think that would be recessionary.
Glenn, I want to ask you about this issue of taxes, because the points Jen was just making about what he considers intransigence, I suspect you would have a different word for it, on the part of the Republicans, is kind of key in terms of thinking what can happen with respect to not just the fiscal cliff, but some kind of a grand bargain that fixes the deficit for the longer term. And obviously, Republicans have been relatively firm that they do not want taxes to go up, and the tax reforms that they've talked about, including the tax reform that your candidate, Mitt Romney, is talking about, are revenue-neutral tax reforms. Now, I know I've known you for a long time also, and I know that long before you joined Mitt Romney's campaign, you're an advocate of tax reform. And in fact, I'm quite sure that your first words as a baby were not "Mama Dada," but lower the rates, broaden the base. But all that said, if the only way to get that grand bargain done and the tax reform that you think is so important is to also accept higher revenue, is that possible? Is there flexibility in there, even if it's not the entering position going in?
Well, it's a great question. I think we're actually starting the conversation in the wrong place. And first of all, the fiscal cliff is serious. It's potentially 3.5% of GDP drag. My guess is what would actually happen is more like 1%, but an economy growing this slowly, that's not just a slump. The reason I think we're starting in the wrong place is the fundamental choice about government is how big it is. I mean, I agree with Jared that if we actually wanted the government the president has proposed, you would have to raise taxes to pay for it. The president has government 23 to 24% of GDP and rising. There's no way you could pay for that with the tax system that we have. But I think we could have a smaller government. And if we have a smaller government, we can have a revenue neutral tax reform. Either way, it strikes me you want a tax code that does either what Bowles-Simpson does, which is broaden the base, lower the rates, and raise revenue, or what Governor Romney's proposing, broaden the base, lower the rates, and break even. But the president's plan of narrowing the base and raising marginal rates, boy, that doesn't strike me as very good tax policy. I think there is a good chance if the president wins, we go over the cliff.
So Maya, you just heard two relatively pessimistic interpretations here. You know, Maya, I've spent a lot of years in Washington writing about budget matters. I just have to say that when I feel like I'm tugged to and fro by the Glenn Hubbards and the Jared Bernsteins of the world, the place I go is the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget to tell me the straight stuff on the numbers. But I think the president, you'll admit, is a time that requires a forecasting ability as well beyond the kinds of things that can be done in a spreadsheet, because we're talking about political permutations that are extremely complex, the makeup of the Congress, the House, the Senate, the White House, a fiscal cliff that happens over a course of just a few days. Talk to me a little bit about what are some of the permutations possible? Does it require a variety of bargains of different sizes? What's the likeliest outcome? Is it just kick the can down the road? Or do you get kind of something smaller that then inextricably leads to something bigger?
Okay, well, as you just laid out, it's a really complicated situation to try to game out. And there's so many scenarios and so many different ways this unfolds. But the bottom line is we know what we have to do. Right? We face these structural deficits and a debt that's growing to unsustainable levels. We need to put in place a plan that's big enough to stabilize the debt at a reasonable level, put it down on a downward trajectory so it's growing slower than the economy, in the neighborhood of $4 trillion over 10 in the beginning. And basically the types of policies that are going to get us there are very well known, probably with the exception of knowing the full basket of healthcare reforms that we're going to have to put in place. We know how to do this. So what stands in the way of this country and a deal is the political environment, which is really, really difficult. And so I think it definitely depends how the election plays out. I think the good news is that this issue wasn't treated as terribly during the election as it could have been. In my mind, I was watching two people who knew that whoever won was going to have to govern over a very difficult, challenging time. And I think the critical piece of all of this is any deal is going to have to be bipartisan. Any political party that thinks that they want to do this on their own is nuts, and they're going to be in the majority for a very short amount of time. You want the cover of bipartisanship, and otherwise I don't think we'll get a real deal in place. So I think the first thing that's important is whoever wins, and this may be against how they feel if they win, they actually have to come out not dug in on either of those issues. So I think if the president wins and he comes out and says, I'm letting those upper income tax cuts expire no matter what, instead of saying, I believe we have to get that $1 trillion. I believe it has to be from the same group of people, but I'm open to different ways for how to get that money. That's a big difference in how this deal unfolds. So if they sort of put an olive branch walking away from one of the hard lines. Same if Romney wins. I think you've got to acknowledge as quickly as possible that revenues are going to have to be part of a deal, and that Republicans have been right to push the notion that structural entitlement reform has to be part of the deal, and there are different ways to get there. But all of that said, it scares me that we're talking about going over the fiscal cliff because they can't get along. I mean, that's saying we're going to put our country into recession in all likelihood because they can't work it out. And I think you don't want to go over the fiscal cliff. You don't want to punt, which is what normally happens in Washington. What you want to do is have the credible first step in the lame duck, and I don't know exactly what that looks like. It could well look like some kind of a down payment of $200 billion coupled with a process to get a bigger debt deal in the next 6 months or so. I think that would be a reasonable scenario under either president. And I think if you don't do something serious in the lame duck to show that we're going to start making these policy choices that will put us in place on a debt deal, it becomes harder to do it afterwards. And I don't really understand the idea of going off of the cliff and then we'll get a deal. People say, well, we'll be working off of a different revenue baseline. Listen, nobody thinks about budget baselines except for us. It's not going to make a deal all that much easier. So I sure hope we don't go off the cliff, we don't punt, but we use that moment in the lame duck to start a smaller package, and then the next 6 months perhaps to put in place that bigger framework of a $4 trillion deal.
You know, Glenn and Jared, I see both of you nodding, and yet both of you think we're going over the fiscal cliff. So what's your reaction to what Maya just said?
I don't think we are. I think if there's there's multiple electoral scenarios, but certainly a scenario under which Governor Romney, as President Romney, is likely to be in a position to be able to move the goalposts and carry out such a plan. I don't think the president has indicated an interest in tax reform at all. I mean, I'd be delighted to hear that the president wanted to raise money from upper income taxpayers by broadening the base. There's a little bit of that in his budget, but certainly he still has raising marginal rates as his centerpiece.
So a couple of things. I mean, I think I was nodding because I thought a lot of what Maya said was sensible and I think felicitous. That doesn't mean that the political system is going to deliver that. So I was trying to be somewhat realistic in my discussion. I don't think the president wants to go over the fiscal cliff. In fact, recent comments he's made has suggested that he thinks there may be some progress brewing in there, including a comment about the sequestration in the third debate.
Which he quickly walked back from, though.
He has said, I am confident, as opposed to it won't happen. Look, Glenn is a super reasonable guy who I very much enjoy talking to. And listening to him, again, my head nods because I'm hearing reasonable things. Listening to the candidate he represents on fiscal policy, I do not hear reasonable things. And so the idea that Governor Romney, who has said, there's no way I'm going to raise any taxes. I have a $5 trillion tax cut over 10 years. I'm not going to tell you how I'm going to pay for it. And I'm going to make the Bush tax cuts permanent. That strikes me as a fiscal policy that walks into this discussion with a massive hole in the ground. And in fact, if there's the thing that's frustrated me the most about the Romney-Ryan campaign thus far is not the idea that this idea of cutting the rates and broadening the base. Most economists really like that idea. It's that the refusal to give you any specifics. And then when responsible analysts like the Tax Policy Center say you can't do it, the math doesn't work out, your base broadeners don't nearly offset the revenue losses that you're going to generate, they throw those studies away. They dismiss them. It can't be right, and they lurch from here to there with, now it's exemptions and deductions. So I find Glenn to be very sensible on fiscal, and I'll bet you if the three of us, and you, the four of us, went into a room, we could resolve this. But that's not what I'm hearing from his bosses.
So Maya, you're the one who's actually allowed to sort of like look through some of this stuff. And my question to you is, do you think that Obama and Romney are actually closer than their campaigns and their debate performances imply, in that there's a lot of posturing now, and that we essentially have, to borrow a term, an Etch-a-Sketch moment on November 7, when a lot of that rhetoric goes away and there's a flexibility that's not there now?
That's an interesting point, because I think that all the time. I think if you actually looked at this as how close are they in terms of what they would like to see, when you really dig down into the numbers and the specifics, I don't think they'd be particularly far apart at all. I mean, Glenn is right that part of the question is how big or small is government going to be? And I think this overall deal shifts a little bit bigger under Obama, a little bit smaller, not size of the deal, but size of government under Romney. But basically, the overall components of how you would get there are pretty much the same. For one, because the problem is so big that when you try to fix it, you kind of have to do everything. You have to look through defense, you have to look through other mandatories, you have to do what you can on Medicare and Medicaid. Social Security needs to be fixed. You're going to have to get some revenues because you can't possibly get there without doing so. You're probably going to have to get revenues from people making below $250 as well. Pretty much everyone needs to walk away from their revenue pledges, which aren't really going to last. And obviously, that's how we set up our political system, right? To focus on the differences instead of the common parts of it. But if you look at what the lines of their preferred budgets are, if you look at them on graphs, because we do this, they're not that different. But the question is how you pivot on November 7th to a political moment where somebody's going to be able to bring everybody to the table really quickly and talk about those compromises. And you can make these issues as big and different as you want. And when you're talking about things like fixing Social Security and raising taxes, where pretty much everybody is going to line up against them and demagogue on them unless we make this something that the whole country wants to come together and do, it's pretty vulnerable. But But I think they're two candidates who both sincerely believe we need to fix this situation and who both understand what it requires to, and I think they face tough political environments.
Greg, I'm sorry,
Yeah.
can I come in on a couple of these
Sure.
points? One on the Romney tax plan. The Bowles-Simpson Commission shows that it's possible to have marginal rates of exactly the level Governor Romney is proposing and actually raise 2 percentage points of GDP. If it interests anybody, Harvey Rosen at Princeton, Marty Feldstein at Harvard, Greg Mankiw, John Taylor, and myself have all done studies to document the feasibility both on revenue and on distribution. So I don't want to let that comment stand. On revenue about middle income people having to be more involved, I think sometimes there's a naivete in talking about the budget that you could have the larger government the president wants without taxing other people. If you look at the OECD, countries with larger governments tend to actually have less progressive tax systems. The redistribution is done on the spending side. They finance themselves with consumption taxes. That's not because they love rich people. It's because both arithmetic, there's not enough money there, and economics, the distortions are simply too high. So the really honest choice is smaller government and something like the current tax system, reformed or not, or the president's government with a much different and higher tax system for everyone.
I actually want to talk a little bit about the spending side. We've talked a lot about taxes, but you don't really fix this problem unless you also address the spending, especially the entitlement side. And honestly, I don't see a lot of detail from either candidate that bends the cost curve over the next 20 to 30 years. I see a lot of attacking provider rates from the president. I see talk of vouchers and Medicaid block granting from Governor Romney. But of course, the impact on the deficit depends entirely on how fast you let those block grants and vouchers grow. And these are really, really tough political questions. So tell me, maybe each of you could address how you think these incredibly hard questions, especially with the first baby boomers, by the way, turning 65 in the last 12 months, how we get through the spending, how we get spending in a serious way involved in this grand bargain in the next 12 months.
Well, 2 points. First of all, I have a bit of good news on that front that I don't think is as widely appreciated as it should be. And I'll get to that in a second. First, I'm very much compelled to correct Glenn on this Bowles-Simpson comparison. First of all, Governor Romney has taken off the table some of the very deductions that Bowles-Simpson goes after.
Governor Romney has taken not a single
Investment
deduction,
income. So Governor Romney,
saving and investment, yes.
So,
yes.
oh, okay.
That's not a deduction.
I was about to try to make some news here. Okay, so the investment income is a non-trivial part of and by the way, what we're talking about is the tax deductibility of the preferential tax rates on investment income. That's a big part of Bowles-Simpson.
Actually,
now,
it's a small part, but
the mortgage interest.
no, I mean, facts are facts.
The mortgage interest deduction, the health care exclusion. You guys need to tell us give us something to go on here. Look, here's the pretty good. I think pretty good news. I'd be interested in Maya's take on this as well. Thus far, the president working with the Congress, this has been bipartisan, have actually cut $1.5 trillion over 10 years in spending off of the August 2010 baseline, which is the baseline that Bowles-Simpson is keyed off of. $1.7 trillion if you had interest savings. That's actually 70% of the discretionary cuts that Bowles-Simpson called for. So if you're all about Bowles-Simpson in terms of bringing your outlays down, actually the president and Congress have gotten part of the way there. But and I would agree with you that there's going to have to be more there. And I think the president in his 2013 budget not only talks about the kinds of cuts I just mentioned, but also actually crosses a bit of a Rubicon for Democrats by proposing cuts in Medicare and Medicaid. Now, Medicare cuts are about $300 billion over 10. Medicaid are only about $66 billion over 10. So I will readily admit that that's merely a start when we're talking about bringing the social insurance spending in line. But it's a serious start, and it's one that should get a lot more credit. The Congressional Budget Office, okay, talk about details which we haven't gotten from the other side. The Congressional Budget Office has scored that plan, that budget, as actually stabilizing the debt to GDP ratio within the 10-year budget window, and that's
And
a
then it
real
explodes
accomplishment.
right after and reduces GDP.
Right, so let's
Still,
talk
that 10-year window, that's a real accomplishment.
within 10 years.
But Glenn, let's pivot to what a Romney administration would do to really bend the cost curve on entitlements.
Well,
And
I mean,
especially given, as Maya was saying, this has got to be bipartisan. There is no history of those things being solved in an enduring way on a partisan
Correct,
basis.
and let's start with Social Security, because in some sense this is easiest to describe for all of us as economists, and it's also the easiest for politicians potentially to come together on. Governor Romney proposed gradually increasing the retirement age and slowing benefit growth for affluent people. He used the example of progressive indexation of benefits. I don't recall another major party candidate for the presidency ever to have been that specific. Vice President Biden told an audience, we're not going to change Social Security. So, I mean, there's a polar difference there. I view that as not only specific, but it's quite progressive. And I think the key to being bipartisan here is to say the benefit reductions need to be on upper income people, not on lower and middle income people. Medicare really is two parts. One is to move toward premium support, but the other is how do you tilt the premium support across income groups? And there again, what Governor Romney said is the bulk of the support should be for lower income people. So the country can afford a strong safety net. What it can't afford is a large welfare state for everyone. For Medicaid, yes, a block grant, and yes, the formulas do matter, but I think there's every reason to believe under a block grant you would see significant cost reductions. Now you might say you'd like to see even more, but I'm not familiar with any candidate for the president that's been that specific on any of these, and certainly we've heard nothing from the sitting president on those.
Maya, I want to come to you, but just to the audience. In a few minutes, we're going to take a question or two from the audience, so put up your hand. We have folks with microphones who will come to you and be ready with your question. But Maya, I wanted you to respond to that. Do you see between these two gentlemen the makings of agreement on entitlements?
Well, I think your question was exactly right, which is the key to all of this is reforming entitlements, and it hasn't been discussed or it doesn't have enough specificity at all on either side for us to know how that's going to work. One of the big risks is that even while I would make the case that you have to have all parts of the budget and revenues have to be a part of it, it's easy to get a lot of revenues quickly, but it's hard to get these entitlement savings quickly. And that's the real problem in the budget, and that's why the Obama budget doesn't stay stabilized for long at all, because they don't do the reforms on entitlements. Social Security.
And I would add, by the way, it's also why Romney's plan not to touch anybody who's 55 or older doesn't bend the curve at all in the first 10 years of the window.
The whole promise not to touch anybody 55 or older, I understand the politics of it, but it means we miss all the baby boomers where we could be getting some savings from the people who don't need it. On Social Security, we know how to fix it. There's 5 moving pieces. You put them together in a menu. It really isn't that hard. We should be doing that one as quickly as possible. And every year that we don't, it ends up costing a whole lot more because of the wasted time. Healthcare, it's really interesting because we don't know the answers. Basically, what I think we're going to see, and what we've already seen, is different approaches to trying to cap healthcare spending. On one hand, you have IPAB, which kind of caps it and creates a default. On the other hand, you have a premium support method that puts a cap on it. It doesn't say how you're going to stay under the cap. They both make it sound like it is easier than it really is. I think those are the necessary first steps. We're going to have to put a budget on healthcare. It's going to have to be part of the budget. But the real trick is going to be what are we going to do to the delivery system and to the incentives in Medicare and Medicaid to keep the cost within those caps. And we're going to continue to have to do healthcare reforms over and over and over again. Thereby, my advice is do absolutely as much as we possibly can right away, and we know it still won't be enough. And this is going to be a constant rejiggering. Technology is creating more healthcare that we all want and we want to spend money on. But I do think the plans, both sides, are sort of putting a cap on it and not filling in the details how you stay within the cap, and then they fight about it for an awful long time.
I don't disagree with a lot of what Maya just said, and I actually think a lot of what Glenn said, again, made fiscal sense. However, again, there's a too large a gap between Glenn and Governor Romney on this issue. And one of the things that I found, really quite disheartening was the way President Obama and Representative Ryan, of course, the vice presidential candidate, actually reduced Medicare spending by over $700 billion over 10 years. Now, I may not like the way Representative Ryan then goes and spends those savings. I think he puts them into these trickle-down tax cuts that I think are a bad use of resources. And I know you don't like the way President Obama spends it by improving coverage, particularly under Medicaid in the Affordable Care Act. But then for Governor Armey to go and put that back in to repeal those savings strikes me as not only pandering, but exactly the opposite of the kind of entitlement responsibility that we're trying to muster here.
I actually do want to get a question in from the audience because we only have a few more minutes. Is there anybody with a question out there? If you do, put up your hand. Right here.
It's on.
My name is Carl Bailey. I'm a financial advisor, and really quickly, this is math. I mean, a couple of the candidates have said this is math. If we know how much we've all paid into Medicare and Social Security, we get a statement every 2 years. I've had a lot of very wealthy people say, hey, I've paid into it my whole life. We can show what people have paid in. We can show when they've exhausted what they've paid in, plus their employer's match plus interest. It has to be means tested. With all due respect, I don't know what the current administration's plan is on Medicare and Social Security cuts. On top of this problem, none of the federal employees have ever had anything put away for them. That comes out of current budget. There's another financial crisis that we're not even talking about, and that is anyone who's ever worked for any branch of the federal government, their health insurance and their medical package, lifetime benefits, nothing's ever been put away for them. They're not in Medicare and Social Security. That's the military, all government employees, Congress, Senate, and so on. So this is a math question. How do you not discuss it in the middle of a crisis? I have been listening to President Obama and Vice President Biden's program. I don't know what their ideas are other than to not discuss them and to throw stones. I'm not supporting Romney in this comment, but I don't know what the administration's plan is to address a financial crisis. It's black and white. It's simple math.
If you vote in Ohio, though, would you please support? No, just kidding.
Jared, quickly.
Sure.
We have a
Okay, I'll
few
try to be
minutes
quick.
left. Yeah.
Though you raise a lot of issues that are somewhat complex. I actually think, just quickly, and maybe we can talk about this further, because you clearly understand the structure of these programs. The math isn't, in some ways, isn't quite as simple as you said, because you suggested, I think, that people should get back what they put in precisely to these programs. That's not the way they work, and it's not the way they should work. Social Security, in particular, has a progressive distribution system, and I think that's actually fine. Look, for all the complexities you raise, and you raise good ones, if we don't reduce the cost of healthcare growth, not only are we toast in the sense that you made, but it's worse in the private sector. The rate of what we call the excess cost burden, the rate at which healthcare spending exceeds that of GDP per capita is more unsustainable in the private versus the public sector. The answer to your question from my perspective, and the president, I think, has articulated this, is that the mechanisms which Maya alluded to, particularly on the provider side, to dampen the increase in spending costs are embedded in the Affordable Care Act. There's some evidence that they're already starting to bear some fruit, but we're going to have to watch that very carefully. If they fail to work, we absolutely have to go back to the drawing board.
We have 1 minute left. Maya, I want you to answer the last bit of the questioner's comment about we're going to have a financial crisis if we don't address these. I hear this all the time. I'm sure you do. I'm looking at the bond market. I'm seeing Treasury yields the lowest in recorded history. They're obviously not getting the memo.
Right.
Who's right, the questioner or the Treasury market?
Right. Well, right, and we almost default, and Treasury and
Yields go down.
when he comes here to
Default
mistake.
isn't the right word there. But.
Well, when we almost did. So, and the best line of this, of course, is the one that the reason is because we're the best looking horse in the glue factory, right? And that's not something that's going to last for very long. And so when you're the safe haven because you're just better than the others, not because your economy is strong and your political system is functioning, it's not going to last forever. And having no idea when the tipping point will occur. And we actually hosted a whole conference called What Will the Tipping Point Be? And that was cheerful, as you can imagine. And the answer is because there's so many possible landmines out there. There's not only the fiscal crisis, there's what's going on in the States. There's unfunded pensions. There's contagion from around the world. So there are many things that it could be. And in all likelihood, when it happens quickly, and it happens incredibly painfully. And the terrible situation here is we have the luxury of being the safe haven, which means we can do a debt deal on our own terms. We can put it in place now. We can phase it in very, very gradually so as not to disrupt the economic recovery. And we lose all of those benefits if we wait, because we're playing chicken with the credit markets, to find out when that happens. And the clear point is that if you had said a couple years ago you could have a debt crisis or a fiscal crisis in this country, it would have seemed absolutely inflammatory. You wouldn't have believed it. And now we all know that what is going on in Europe is, you start to understand it's not impossible to happen here. And if we continue to delay, the risks are, I couldn't put the time on it, but certainly there's a real risk that in the short term, the next few years, if people believe that the political system won't get it right, you start to see a loss of confidence in the credit markets, and that could spiral very quickly.
There's about 30 more questions that I could ask on this topic that would take another 2 days to work our way through. We'd probably still not get the answer, but it's been a great start. Thank you very much, all of you, for some very provocative observations.
Thank you, Greg.
Thank you. Okay.